So good morning again. I want to talk this morning about the sort of overlap between the Dharma and 12-step recovery programs. And I'm not I haven't been involved in a 12-step program. I have family members that have, and I've have worked with many people over the years that have. And you know, as I what I know about it, I should say, is it's intrigued me the overlap or the convergence between the two approaches. So I want to talk about that a little bit today and just and maybe get your thoughts in a little while. But people struggling with all kinds of addiction, substances, behaviors, patterns of thinking, gambling, spending, running marathons, whatever, um, you know, often will find their way to the Dharma, but also out of 12 step. We have a lot of people in this community who will remain anonymous that participate in both. And it's not in their actual programs called Recovery Dharma and Kevin Griffin's work on 12 steps in Dharma as a teacher out west that really emphasize this overlap. And from a secular Buddhist perspective, this convergence makes perfect sense. Both traditions start with a foundation of unflinching honesty. The life I'm living now is not working. I'm either addicted to something, or I'm suffering because I'm addicted to something, or whatever. And the common ground there is that both ask us not to look away from our pain, not to run from our pain. They give a practical step-by-step path out of that pain. Not through magical thinking, not through, but through sustained effort, through community, both in Sangha and in what they call the rooms in 12 step, and a willingness to look at life in an unvarnished, clear way. And I really love that in both instances. And I've seen remarkable success in people's lives who have embraced a 12 step journey. But the first noble truth of dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, mirrors this first step of admitting powerlessness over um, uh, uh, with striking precision. But it's that sense of I acknowledge the suffering that comes from my powerlessness. It says we were in Alcoholics Anonymous. They say we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable, which is really another way of saying I'm really suffering here. You strip away the substance abuse reference, and what remains is this sort of universal notion that many of us are familiar with on this path. And the idea is that in both instances, I can't think my way out of this. All the strategies I've tried have failed. The thing I believe would save me is really destroying me. This form of avoidance that I'm using, whether it's substances or anything else, is not the answer. And and in secular Buddhism, we don't interpret dukkha, suffering, as some cosmic pronouncement about the nature of existence. We understand it practically, that our suffering comes from our clinging, our grasping. When we grasp at pleasure, when we push away pain, which is exactly what happens with addictions, when we build our entire identity, or at least in the addiction world, around the next drink, the next fix, the next distraction, we suffer. It's a form of avoidance. Step one in AA asks us to stop pretending otherwise, and not as a weakness, but as the beginning of wisdom. The Buddha didn't sit beneath the Bodhi tree because his life was going well. He was looking for answers. He sat there because he felt he had exhausted every other option. He'd been a wandering ascetic. He nearly starved himself to death. He'd indulged in all the sensual pleasures at his father's palace. Neither had worked. And you'll hear people say that when they walk into that first meeting, in their own way, they were sitting down beneath the Bodhi tree. The second noble truth, of tanha, craving, thirst, is the origin of suffering. Anyone you talk to has experienced addiction in their life. This requires no philosophical explanation. They know craving in their bones. They know it firsthand. They can talk to you about it forever. And they also recognize, they've come to a point where they recognize that this craving narrows their world to a single point, and that is whatever the thing or the substance is that they're seeking to relieve their suffering. They'll talk about how it whispers to them, one more drink, one more drink, one more hit, one more click, and they'll be okay. And that's the constant refrain. I would suggest, though, that secular Buddhism offers a deeper look. Craving is not merely the desire for some substance or some escape, although it is that. It's a fundamental misalignment of our relationship with experience itself. For instance, we want permanence in an impermanent world. We think that's going to be our ticket. We crave a solid self when we're really in flux and fluid. Addiction is simply craving what's visible and what's the most destructive expression of that. But the mechanism is universal. It coexists in each tradition. And then in 12 steps 4 through 7, the moral inventory, the admission of wrongs, the readiness to have my defects removed, the humble request for their removal, map directly into the investigation of craving. Now, often people get hung up in the 12-step tradition on this notion of higher power. And they think it implies a religious orientation. But there are secular 12-step programs. There are programs which treat the higher power as the teachings of the Buddha, or as nature, or as the universe. I mean, it doesn't specify a deity. It's certainly implied, and there are many programs which embrace that model. But it's not, in my view, essential for folks that are seeking that path, the 12-step path. When they talk in 12-step programs about a fearless moral inventory, I understand that to mean what they're talking about, what we call seeing clearly. No longer kidding oneself, no longer deluding oneself. That fearless moral inventory is, this is who I am, warts and all. We name those parts of ourselves without flinching. We neither require nor accept that we have to hand it over to someone. We see that we have to sort of acknowledge our powerlessness, but it doesn't mean that we don't have some tools to let go, to relinquish this clinging that is so pervasive in the suffering. And then we have the Sangha, just like the community of people committed to the same path. We see that in 12 steps. The Dharma itself, the simple, observable truth that our actions have consequences, that nothing is permanent, that clinging produces suffering, this vast interconnected web of causes and conditions that constitutes reality. This is all very consistent with 12 steps. And when in step 3 of that program, ask us to turn over our will. Secular Buddhism might reframe this in saying, stop insisting that your limited habitual pattern of thinking or behaving are adequate to solve the problem. We relinquish that belief that we can clinch it down, tighten down, and control what's going on. And so surrender in that context is not submission to a deity, although for some folks it is. It is the release of the delusion that the same mind that created the problem can, through sheer force of will, solve it, which just is not true. We surrender to the notion that through sheer force of will we can solve the problem. This is an opening to something larger than our ego. And what we call that something is less important than our willingness to open to it. Okay? The practical heart of Buddhist teaching, mindfulness, may be the single most useful tool available to folks in both traditions. Not mindfulness as a relaxation technique or a corporate wellness buzzword, but mindfulness as the Buddha taught it. Clear, moment-to-moment awareness of what is actually happening in the body and mind. Clear, moment-to-moment awareness of what is actually happening in the body and mind. Craving arises. This is a fact. I acknowledge it. The question is, what do we do in the space between craving and our action? Do we just willy-nilly give into the craving? Our mindfulness practice helps us create that space, that interruption, that pause. It teaches us that craving is not a command to which we are prisoner. It is simply a sensation in the body, a thought in the mind, a wave that arises, and if we don't feed it, indulge it, it then falls. It is impermanent. We haven't talked about it in a long time, but if you remember the RAIN technique, this is one Tara Brach teaches. I learned it from her years ago. It stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and not identify. Okay. So we recognize what's coming up. A craving's coming up. Okay, I allow it to come up. I look at it, I pause, I investigate it, and then I don't identify with it. I don't act on it. I recognize this craving. I allow it to be here without fighting it. I investigate what does it feel like in my body and mind. And I remember that I am not this craving. It is simply another experience that is passing through me. So it's this ongoing, daily, moment to moment practice of paying attention. Doesn't mean we're doing it all the time, but when something strong arises or something that grabs our attention, we want to pay attention to it, not just push through on autopilot. You know, not just occasionally when things are bad, not just when we're on retreat, but always as a way of life. The Buddha's Eightfold Path is essentially a program for living well that overlaps beautifully with the 12 steps. They both cover how we think, how we speak, how we act, how we earn our living, how we train our minds, how we behave ethically. You know, the 12 steps has, steps that involve um, making a list of who we've harmed and making amends. That's forgiveness piece that we talk about. Right action, right speech are concrete and specific. They are the Dharma with, as I like to say, with names and addresses attached. They ask us to take the abstract principle of non-harming and apply it to the actual people we may have harmed. As in step 12, carrying the message to others, this bodhisattva ideal of expressed in the language of recovery, that we want to help alleviate suffering in others. There's a tremendous emphasis on that in 12 steps, reaching out, sponsoring, and so forth. So we offer it freely, not from a position of superiority, not from a position of I'm better than you, but from a shared ground of our common vulnerability. And one of the things I most love about folks that have gone through 12-step programs is that, this notion of common vulnerability. There's not a whole lot of pretense in those rooms, in my experience of working with folks in that program. One of the most practical teachings out of the Dharma, I think, for recovery is this notion of impermanence, that everything changes, that, this can, on the one hand, be a source of suffering if we deny it and resist it, or it can be the ground for hope if we embrace it, that the craving will pass, that the shame I'm feeling will pass, it's not permanent. When people in early sobriety will tell you every minute feels like an hour, but that too will pass. But so too will complacency pass. This is why both emphasize ongoing effort, ongoing practice. Recovery in that tradition is not a destination. It is, as with the Dharma, a daily commitment. We renew it each morning. We get up and make our intentions clear each morning. We return to our sitting practice again and again, even when we're having some doubt. The practice is the path itself. Now, there's also this notion that impermanence helps us with compassion when we trip up, whether that's a relapse if we're struggling with addiction or doing harm on the other hand. We bring self-compassion. What they say in AA is the person that drank yesterday is not the same person that's sitting in the meeting today. We are processes, not fixed entities. We are always in flux. And I find that a really hopeful message. I'm not stuck here where I am with all my suffering. I'm ever changing. And I find that a hopeful message. It makes change conceivable. It makes change possible. If we were truly fixed permanent selves, change would be impossible. We would just be stuck where we are, but we're not. So change is always available to us right now in this moment. And I think both programs teach that. With Buddhism, what Buddhism brings to the recovery movement, and I think, people that do both can really benefit, which is sometimes missing, I think, from 12 step, is this rigorous insistence on direct experience over belief. You don't have to believe that mindfulness works, but you practice it and you observe the results. You don't need to accept the Four Noble Truths on faith. We examine our own lives and see that the clinging has caused us tremendous suffering in all aspects. We don't have to believe that, there's some cosmic accounting system out there, somebody keeping score. We simply see that our actions have consequences right now. We see that kindness begets kindness, that honesty, however painful, lays the groundwork for trust in our relationships. And this empirical approach, which is one of the real attractions to me, is profoundly respectful of those of us on the path and profoundly respectful of people in recovery. It does not ask them to trade one form of dependency, say on a substance, for another, that being a belief system. It doesn't say you've been dependent on alcohol, now you have to be dependent on believing this particular dogma. It says look at things clearly, act wisely, and stay connected to others in your community who are doing the same. So what might this look like in day-to-day life and practice? It might look like in the morning, a brief meditation, just 5 minutes of watching the breath. We don't have to do our whole meditation in the morning. Setting an intention for the day with the right intention, maybe reading a passage from recovery literature or Buddhist teaching. And then during the day, notice when cravings arise for substances, for control, for how other people should behave, for escape, for approval, for ego gratification. The list goes on and on. But the intention is to pause before we give in to any of those. We ask, what is actually happening right now? We speak truthfully. We speak kindly. That's right speech. We make amends to people we've caused harm. That's step 10 in recovery. And then in the evening, as we talked about recently, one in the morning, one in the evening, we do a brief inventory of the day. Not to punish ourselves, but it's like sort of a data review with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment. Gratitude for what went well, honest acknowledgement of what didn't go well, and then a recommitment to doing it different tomorrow. We go to regular meetings of our community. We practice with others. We have a willingness to be known, to be imperfect, to ask for help. The Buddha was not a god. He never presented himself that way. He was a human being who suffered, who investigated his suffering with extraordinary courage, with extraordinary clarity, and who found a way through it. Similarly, the founders of AA were not saints. They were desperate people who discovered that honesty, community, and a willingness to change would accomplish what willpower alone could not. The two traditions do not need to be reconciled because I don't believe they're really in great conflict. They are maps of the same territory, the human heart and its struggle to be free from suffering. One was conceived 26 years ago in northern India. The other was drawn up in 1935, I think, in Akron, Ohio. Both point to the same destination, not perfection, not bliss, not escape from humanity and the human condition, but something much more modest and profound. The ability to be present with our lives as they actually are without needing to be numb, excuse me, without needing to flee, without needing to destroy things. That's enough. That's everything. The Buddha says, the Dharma that I have taught is like a raft for crossing over, not for holding on to. The Dharma that I have taught is like a raft for crossing over, not for holding on to. The the big book in AA says we are not cured of alcoholism. What we really have is a daily reprieve contingent upon a maintenance of our spiritual condition. Again, a raft for crossing over, not for holding on to. Both are telling us to keep going, stay on the path. The path is the practice is the path. So, some thoughts today on the Dharma and 12 steps. Let's talk about it.